Good evening, everybody. Great to see so many of you on such a beautiful evening, exactly the sort of evening that the Cherwell Boathouse is meant for. I'm delighted to welcome you all. In particular, I'm delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Danny Dorling, Professor Danny Dorling. I think my first encounter with Danny was on a rather eccentric riverine expedition a few years ago. But that hasn't put him off, I hope. So it's entirely appropriate that tonight's talk is on the banks of the River Cherwell, which is the very same river I think we met on first. Danny's going to speak this evening about the next crisis, which just happens, coincidentally, to be the title of his most recent book, published last month. Danny is professor at the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. Or to give his professorship its full name, Danny is the 1971 Professor of Geography, which was formerly titled the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography, but that's another story and we won't go into that now. Danny was previously a professor at the University of Sheffield and before then the University of Leeds. He's also worked as an academic in Newcastle and Bristol, but most importantly, he was born and brought up in Oxford. He has written a number of books. In 2020, he published Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration, and Why It's Good for the Planet, the Economy, and Our Lives. And in 2021, jointly with Annika Koljonen, Fintopia, What We Learned from the World's Happiest Country. I thought that was Denmark. Anyway, sorry.
No.
He slowed down for a year in 2022, and the 2023 book was titled Shattered Nation, Inequality of the Geography of a Failing State. And in 2024, he published two books, Seven Children and Peak Injustice. As mentioned earlier, his latest book, published last month, is The Next Crisis. Welcome, Danny, and many thanks for coming to speak to us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jens. Denmark comes second.
Somebody's got to.
7 years in a row. Surveys are interesting. I think the Finns now know when they are randomly called up and there's a survey and they're asked how happy are you on a scale from 0 to 10. There's a national pride in Finland. So they keep ahead of the Danes. They're Danes just. Let me tell you a little bit about me and then I'll go through the book. I'm not going to take more than half an hour because I want to know what you think more than what I think. I first was on that river in 1971, I think. It could have been earlier, but my first memory is 1971. So I grew up here. I can tell you what the next crisis is. It's next week in my department, because I'm currently chair of Final Honours School, which this is the most stressful week of the academic year at the university, for academics. Most of the marks are in, but my colleague who's just set off on the Amazon, literally, I'm not exaggerating, has promised us that the Starlink connection he's got to the internet means that he will get his marks in. So if I look stressed, I'm de-stressing from only providing 75 students with a single degree class each by next Friday. That's my day job. Right, I'm an academic, and we do those kinds of things. I've worked or moved around the country, but mainly just the UK. I left here to get as far away as possible from this boring little town when I was 17 to go somewhere big and exciting. But I wasn't that brave, so I stayed in England. So you can work out exactly where I went. Want to get as far away as possible and stay in England where my mum couldn't drive to. And the answer is Newcastle. I then spent 10 years in Newcastle, then went down to Bristol, went up to Leeds, and then to Sheffield for 10 years, and then back here a dozen years ago. So apart from a few little trips abroad, I'm very, very English. I've mainly written books about England or the UK, but to be honest, mostly about England. And in the last few years, that became a bit depressing because you may not have noticed, but things haven't been going very well in this country in the last few years, and writing about it is depressing. So I thought I'd write about crises. because this is actually an optimistic book, but it's about the world as a whole and trying to put crises in some kind of order. Partly because our students in the geography department tend to be nihilistic. They tend to think that everything is going to end. They're mainly worried about the climate. They think we don't take it seriously. But if it's not the climate and the climate crisis not being addressed, then it's going to be world wars, capitalism falling apart, them personally not getting the kind of jobs that their parents got, which on average is quite likely because their parents tend to be well off in the geography department. I do things which get me into trouble. I don't always mean to. In 2019, I ranked all 89 degree courses in the country that have more than 500 students by how posh they were. And what I found surprised me, at the very top is not classics or veterinary science or what you might expect. At the very top is human geography, my subject. Now somebody has to be at the very top. A subject has to be at the top. By posh, what I mean is a geographical measure. For every student we have in a British geography department who's been brought up in the poorest fifth of the country, we have 12 brought up in the richest fifth. No other degree course across Britain has that ratio. I published this in a discreet journal. It got into tabloids. My colleagues became upset with me. 40-odd heads of the department wrote a letter to the Times Higher saying that we're doing a lot for disadvantaged students, and I was grown up enough not to correct them and say a disadvantaged student per department per year on average, but one. So I tend to use numbers and put my foot in it. You can ask later, why is it geography that has ended up in this position? My suspicion is the fastest way to help geography not be in that position is to publicise the fact it is, and then it's likely that admissions officers from across the country may behave slightly differently about the subject. Geography began in 1899 in this university, one of the very first departments, if not the first. There was a letter to the Times asking for donations because the Royal Geographical Society was willing to back the creation of a geography department to teach young men the skills they needed to run the empire. And there was going to be one free place for one scholar. So we've had widening participation since 1899. The subject of geography in Britain, why you, if you had to do it at O-level? I won't ask how many did A-level. If you wonder why were you learning about tin and rubber and glaciers and floods and cities and all these kind of things, imagine you were going to be put in charge of Nigeria, right? The subject of geography is a subject for training colonial officers. That's great when you've got colonies. That's not so good by the 1960s and 1970s. Geography could have disappeared as a subject in Britain. It hardly exists in any other country. Only 1 in 10 US universities have a geography department. Harvard and Yale closed theirs in the 1960s. The other places in the world where geography is large, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, a bit of Hong Kong, a bit of India. You get the message? My department is number 1 in the world, which sounds less impressive when you realise what the competition is. You have to keep that to yourself. The good news for us and the bad news for you in the world is that while we were almost disappearing, we carried on doing the kind of things we were doing before. We used to have things like weather, that was our subject, until the physicists stole it and made it into meteorology. But we still had glaciers. And it's quite nice in the summer to go up into the Alps and measure a glacier to see how quickly it's coming down for the ice age that's coming. So as geographers, they were the first people who noticed and won, I think they won a Peace Prize for this, noticed that the glaciers were going backwards. Climate change is bad for the planet, but it's very good for the subject of geography. If you want to get out of having to defend that you have a subject which is teaching people how to rule other people, to a subject which is interested in how do people get on with each other, how do you deal with divides and inequalities, not when you're in charge, but when you may be able to give advice, how you deal with volcanoes, how you deal with floods, it's a very different subject. So that's enough about me and my subject. You've got an idea, and hence crisis. Because geography, in a way, is a subject of crises. It's about the future and about what might go wrong and what can you do to worry about it. Now, you're all going to have your own idea of what the worst possible crises might be next. I'd love to poll you, but it'll take too long. But I really would. I'm looking at my watch and realising that I've already taken up quite a lot of time. So we're not going to poll you over what your worries are. There are various ways in which you can rank crises. One is by how much harm they actually cause people. How many people die, how many people are affected. Another way of ranking them is to ask experts in crises. And there are risk officers. All the major companies in the world hire them now. They meet at Davos and they produce a list of the biggest crises that will affect the world in the next year. And that's interesting because to keep their jobs, they have to be a bit speculative and exciting, but they tend to get it wrong, thankfully. The one in the book that I said they got wrong was hacking of large computer systems, but it's always possible. And if you look at the Co-op and M&S and so on, you'll know it happens. So you can see these crises that are concerns, but as yet have not had an effect which is devastating. There are other traditional worries, asteroids, meteors, those kind of things. They really are not worth worrying about. We have got some idea of where the asteroids are. The chances are pretty small. I did a book a few years ago called Population 10 Billion, in which I listed the 44 ways in which life on Earth was expected to end. Killer bees is my favourite one for these guys. And there's AI, and we can talk about that later. There are always esoteric, imaginative problems that hardly ever materialise as the thing that matters most. So, how do you work out what matters most? My preferred method is to use a survey, which has been going for several decades, which occurs every month, now in over 30 countries, where people are asked what they most worry about and given about 18 options. It's run by Ipsos, who are probably the best polling company in Britain, and the questions are asked in a uniform manner so we can compare over time. It's asked in India, in 3 or 4 countries in Africa, most countries in Europe, North America, a few countries in South America, including, I think, Brazil. And the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences asks almost the same questions in its own survey. So we get the majority of the world, but not the poorest countries of the world. These concerns are also the worries of the world middle class, because poor people don't fill in surveys. The crises of the 4 billion people who are poorest in the world are getting through to tomorrow, getting through to next week. Certainly, they're not available for an internet survey, right? So, the list I'm going to give you is a global middle class list. Number 1 is unambiguous, but may surprise you. So try and think of what do you think most of the world's middle class, by middle class I mean middle earning on the planet, not that well off, but also the majority of people in Britain. What is the thing they list as the thing which most worries them and have done for about 10 years? And the answer is poverty and inequality, and more recently the cost of living crisis. But even before the cost of living crisis rose up during the pandemic, poverty and inequality was still number 1. Now we have number 1 and 2. The cost of living crisis hasn't knocked poverty and inequality that far down in people's perceptions. I stick those two together, and it is miles ahead of everything else. And it's, how will I get by? How will I get by in future? How will my children or my parents or my cousins or my siblings get by? And how will those people around me get by? And this has been a major change in 2 decades in perceptions in the world. Right? Attitudes do vary. About 15 years ago, the number one fear was unemployment. And at various times, when the pandemic began, the fear when the pandemic began was we're going to get mass unemployment. I mean, that made complete sense. I was in a meeting with Will Hutton. And Will Hutton, if you know him, former economics editor of The Guardian, Will Hutton just said we're going to have 4 million unemployed by Christmas. So unemployment is a big fear, but inequality and poverty, a complicated issue. The gap between people is the number one in this country and worldwide, coupled with cost of living. People have had enough of not having enough. It's partly an effect of rising inequality, but inequality has only risen really high in a few countries. We are the most unequal country in Europe. It's higher in the USA. It's actually higher in China. But it isn't one of the major fears in China. I'll come to that later. I think partly because almost everybody is so much better off than their grandparents in China, they don't yet worry about the inequality. So that's number one. Number two, in the world of current crises and potential future crises, number two is unemployment. And that completely shocked me. I mean, I wasn't shocked by inequality and poverty because I've been working on it for ages. I was quietly smug and thought, haven't my colleagues done well? I was shocked by myself when I saw that unemployment is hanging at their number two. I mean, we've only got a rate, 3 or 4%? The US is lower. It's not the 1980s. I thought, what's going on? And then I suddenly realised, well, I work at the University of Oxford, and I'm an academic. It's almost impossible to sack me. If I was sacked, I'd be famous, because I would be the first person to be sacked in my position in 800 years. And I've got used in just 10 years to feeling insecure about my job. My colleagues, if you know the situation across the UK and universities, it's voluntary and then not so voluntary redundancy in half of them. I felt really stupid at this point. And the fear of unemployment is the fear of not being needed. And for it to be so high, it has to be across the board. So it's a fear that retired people have, that people around them won't be needed, or their children grown up won't be needed. It's a fear that people of my age have, that we're getting very expensive. I can tell you that my colleagues in other universities around the world of my age, you know, if you've got to make budget cuts, get rid of the 57-year-old man. He almost certainly costs more than anybody else because he's argued his salary up. And it's you know, and he's long in the tooth and he's not that interesting. But that fear is genuine of people in work. It's the fear of the students, including the students at Oxford. The entertainment's wonderful. Sorry, going on. So if you get bored with me, just have a look and see. We may be lucky and somebody might fall in. It's a minor crisis. The students I teach are incredibly worried that they won't get a job. And this is a shock. I wasn't worried when I was a student at Newcastle upon Tyne, because only 1 in 10 of us nationally went to university. You walk into a university back in 1986 and you're sorted for life. You might worry if you came here. I was very glad I didn't come here, because, you know, if you come here, you might not be Prime Minister, or, you know, you could have your hopes dashed and you'd have higher hopes. But such a tiny number of us went to university in the 1980s. You were sorted. Now 50% of young people in this country go to university by the age of 18. 2/3 have walked into university, may not complete a degree, but 2/3 by the age of 30. We have the highest university entry in Europe. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's what happens if you apply the market. Not necessarily foreseen. Those 2/3 of people who've at least started a degree are almost certainly not going to get paid more than a third who have not done a degree. When you look at the numbers, The third who haven't done a degree include the apprenticeships, skilled trades. And I suspect our students are not considering manual labour as one of their options over employment. But they're scared. This fear of unemployment is real. I've only got 4 more to go, and I've got 5 minutes. So the order. So you see whether your fears come up as high. The third biggest fear in the world is violence. Mostly local violence, robbery and burglary and crime. But it includes fear of war and terrorism. That is lower, but for countries abutting a country at war, it is higher. It rises at certain times. That's the third fear. If you ask people a specific question, if you ask them separately from giving them 18 things and say what tick 3 you worry most, if you ask people specifically, are you afraid of nuclear war, you can actually get a majority saying they're afraid of it. But if you give them a whole set of things to worry about, it's number 3. And war and terrorism is much less of a fear than everyday violence and crime. And number 4, you've got services. Worried about the schools falling apart, worried principally about the hospitals, about healthcare, worried about government, worried about corruption, worried about the state. This is the number 1 fear in China. The first fear in China is healthcare. Now it's an elderly population, but also its healthcare system probably isn't as equitable as our state healthcare system. You can get treated faster if you know what to do or who to pay, and that's a worry. Because then there's a question about, do you know how you get treated more? I suspect. I want the book to be, it is being translated into Chinese, so I'm very careful what I say about that. But it's interesting that in China the biggest fear is about services and healthcare, which shows a degree of confidence about those larger fears. Less worry. China is not a country that goes to war. Then, after you go down, yes. The country that goes to war the most, we actually beat the USA, because there was a year when they weren't out of war. But I can show you a map of wars. The next one is climate change. Long way down and dropping. People are becoming lethargic and bored with being told about climate change. The country in the world where people worry most about climate change, or are least likely to think it's a hoax, is Britain. It's one of the few things we're spectacularly good at. It's a confluence of actions that came together. Our political parties agreed not to argue about it until recently. Reform can see it's a way of getting votes. Kemi's intrigued. But in general, they made an agreement not to publicly argue about climate change. And Sky, amazingly, given Sky's ownership, Sky and the BBC also agreed not to present a balanced argument, as it might be called, about is this real or is it not. All that was made much easier by the last 15 years and hot summer after hot summer after hot summer. But climate change is seen as a hoax by more and more people worldwide, or as a way in which the rich tell people that they can't solve their problems because there's something else more important to be dealt with. And that should be a worry. We also have a crying wolf problem. 12 years to save the world, or this place has got to be abandoned because of sea level change, and it turns out it doesn't. Or it is the poor of the world who are most affected by climate change, which you may believe because you're told it so often. But if you look at the number of deaths that are attributed to climate change events, which are heat waves and floods and so on and severe weather, the highest number of deaths are heat waves, and they're in Europe, in Russia and North America. The main thing that makes you at risk of dying in a heat wave is being old. And to get old enough to be at risk of dying in a heat wave, you've got to be fairly well off. Now, I think it'll be useful for us if we realise this, because we have actually a vested interest. It also helps if you're not very good at dealing with the heat, right? And we're not here. So there's a whole sort of set of presumptions that are made. Or I'll give you one other one which is controversial. At the moment, when the temperature rises on the planet, more people live than die because cold kills more people than heat does. Right, so avoiding cold winters, but I'm not wanting to get into, so isn't it great it's warming up? And the last crisis of all, as I turn towards half an hour, is only there because I squeezed all the others together and amalgamated them so I could get this one in, which is the environment and biodiversity and species, which may academically be the most important one of all. You can't recreate species. It may be the most important one of all, but it's certainly not there in most people's concerns. There is a truism in that the better off you are, the less likely you're probably going to worry about the biggest crises because they're not going to affect you. You're better off, so having enough isn't a problem. Unemployment isn't necessarily an issue. You may not even have to work. Right? You may need a job so you can say what you do at dinner parties, but you may not need a job. Crime and violence and war will scare you less, although they may scare you because you might be afraid of the pitchforks. But the sensible thing is to have a home in at least 2 countries so that you can leave. And this is, it may sound trite, but one of the way the Nordic countries operate, or they have a kind of a deal, I think, a subtle deal politically, is they allow the wealthy to keep their wealth in the middle of Oslo and Helsinki, but pay high taxes, but keep their wealth so that you can have a house somewhere else. And if you think about Helsinki, you know, there's always been an expectation the Russians may come in, but you have to have a secure enough life. You have to have a secure enough life to have these kinds of things as your worry. And then going down the list, state services, schools, hospitals and so on, well, if you're wealthy to a certain level, that's not the end of the world, because your children aren't going to be going to those schools and you're not going to be using those hospitals. Then climate change, well, that's bad, but in 300 years it'll be sorted, but still bad. So you have the time to worry about species of butterflies in Oxfordshire and bats, and wouldn't it be nice to bring the beaver back and so on. And I'm being slightly facetious, but my very, very good friend George Monbiot is kind of in this position, or was, of it's easiest for George to worry about the environment because he could become an expert on that. He studied here, he could know all about biology and so on and worry about that. Much harder for him to worry about the other issues. Now, equally hard for me. You know, I was worrying today about the list of prizes that we have to give out to the best people who get the highest marks. Something like 25 prizes. There's 70 odd students. We've got to give them out, and they complain if they don't get one nowadays, and they've got barristers, some of them. But why was I worrying about it? Partly because my grandfather won the Geography Prize in 1938 because I'm a posh boy. Okay. In my department. So I am the Nepo baby of the Geography Department. But there's this interesting thing for me about this ranking of these things that most concern the world's middle class and upper middle class, leaving the long and the distance and the far away things as being less important, but important to some people with enough money to push it up the agenda. When I tell my colleagues, the School of Geography and Environment has just under 500 employees, well over 100 climate change scientists. When I tell my colleagues that this is the order I find, their standard reaction is to tell me the questions have been badly framed, right? And people are giving the wrong answers because they don't know that climate change matters most. And that's interesting to me that they do it. The scariest thing, I'll end on this, the scariest response I've had when I've given this talk in other geography departments is some of my physical geography colleagues looking aghast and telling me, well, people really should be much, much more scared about what's happening to the environment and climate. But they tell me they think it's game over. They don't think we're going to be able to sort this. They think it is now out of hand. I then asked them, why are you still writing papers? Why are you still working? If you do think the climate change is so precarious and is so near the tipping point. And they give me a shrug like, I don't really know what else to do with my life. And I sort of think, oh, if I thought the world was going to end in 20 years' time, I wouldn't be writing another paper for Science or nature. So it's been a really interesting book to write. It's only been out for a week. That's my copy, so I need to keep it. I don't have any copies to sell you. Nobody's yet complained about what I write in it. The book ends positively, and it is pretty positive throughout, because it says, stop thinking that everything is terrible, work out the order in which it is terrible, look at how we've addressed these things in the past, look at the rate at which we have reduced wars, we've reduced violence, look at the rate in which we've introduced things like social security. There was a time when unemployment benefit was seen as a fantasy, the idea you could actually do that. The only reason we worry about state schools and state healthcare is because we have them. You know, some of these are a luxury. Climate change, at least we know it's happening, and at least it's accepted. Biodiversity, the last one, well, 70% of the large species are now extinct. That's too late. But the rate of species extinction has slowed since the 1980s. If it hadn't, we'd all be dead, because we're a large remaining species as well. But it has, and most of the species that have gone are rare on small islands. It's not necessarily all as bad as it looks. And I end on looking at political reactions over the last 300 or 400 years, because so many of these crises are long-standing. Not having enough, inequality and poverty is a long-standing crisis. The fear of not being wanted or needed, that's new. Kind of began in 1886 in this country. But still, that's quite a long time. Fears of violence are quite long-standing. And for all these things, we've tried to address them. The book ends with the 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement, which when I presented this at one school, the prevent officer checked and wasn't sure I could show the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement are interesting. They appeared in 1914 because almost none of them today don't look like complete common sense. If you're an optimist, you can see there's a way in which, over time, slowly, the arc moves in a progressive way, which is why our population has got to 8 billion, which is why living standards are generally higher, which is why we worry when people are treated badly. And we've so far succeeded. That doesn't mean that something completely unexpected might not happen. If you want completely unexpected to end on, think of how short a time it was between when the professor sitting on the bench in Russell Square realised that you could bang two atoms next to each other, and in just over a dozen years later an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Right? The equivalent could be happening now, we've got no idea. But in general, it doesn't. In general, our crises tend to be the old, same, recognisable ones, not the novel things we like to worry about and that help fill newspaper pages. The word crisis wasn't very much used in the past, when we had many. When we had multiple pandemics and epidemics and wars, we didn't talk about crises. It's only in the 1960s that the word enters popular use, with the missile crisis. It's then used more in the 70s, more in the 80s, more in the 90s, more in the first decade of the millennium, and more again up until when they stopped counting it, which is just before the pandemic. So we know when they start counting, this is the Google Ngram count, when they start counting the word crisis again, with the pandemic it's going to go off the scale. It's only been in times of relatively luxury and security that we've been so paranoid about crises, which is a really, really good thing to be. But it shouldn't lead people to thinking there's nothing we can do to make things better. Please ask me some questions, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Questions from the audience. Just before I ask Nicola for the first question, how long has this questionnaire from Ipsos, how long has it been going on for, and has there been a big change over that period of time? Because I'm just thinking about when back in the 60s, everybody's biggest fear was nuclear war. So obviously it's shaped by particular events and issues that happen at a particular time.
Yeah.
But I presume that the survey data is not that far back.
No. In its current form, it goes back about 25 years. It's increased the number of countries that it includes. It would be really interesting to know what groups are most worried. My mother and father met on an Aldermaster march, right? So if you want to work out exactly who I am. And nuclear war absolutely, was their great fear. But they were aware of the possibility when most people weren't. I was a teenager when the atomic clock became closest to midnight. But then in the 1980s, this is what gives me hope, Ronald Reagan, right? Not the quickest and cleverest of US presidents. Ronald Reagan and the Russians came to a deal and got rid of 90% of our warheads over 10 years because they'd only just worked out in the mid-1980s that nuclear war wasn't survivable. And if Reagan can do that, if Republicans, hawks in the 80s can do that, so it's less. But 25 years is the short answer.
Okay, thanks. Nicola, hang on, I think there's a microphone on the way.
If you say the second biggest concern is unemployment, why are there 9 million people economically inactive in this country?
Okay, so why are there 9 million people economically inactive? And this is adults and presumably not at retirement age. That group will include students who are not working. If you remember, students used not to work. Now there's 2 million of them actually employed by their students. It'll include people looking after children who account that, and it include people who are ill or disabled. It may include some people who are skiving, and certainly people who are rich enough not to have to work, which we never talk about, but they are economically active in the census category. It's higher than in other European countries, and that's very likely because we are more ill. And the reason I say it's very likely is, well, we die earlier. When we measure ourselves, we're more ill, we're fatter. But also our benefits are lower. So people are not economically active because the benefits are good. We don't get the 80% of your wage that you get if you're made unemployed in Switzerland. So it's probably the illness and mental illness that's risen. It's become acute since the pandemic, and the differences have become much more obvious. And it is a waste of people's lives. Those people may well be frightened of unemployment themselves, in that they say the thing I'm most worried about is unemployment, and I'm unemployed. Because they don't think they can get a job or they can't get a job. But that's my short version of the answer about it. But you certainly don't solve the unemployment problem by starving people back to work, which is what us in the United States tried to do. You end up with people doing 2 or 3 jobs, and you end up with people getting more and more demoralised. In countries with better unemployment benefits, the classic is Sweden, you have a lower overall rate of unemployment, but most importantly, there isn't a health disbenefit of being unemployed. In this country, years ago, becoming unemployed, everything else taken into account, took on average 2 years off your life expectancy in future. Whereas in Sweden, at least, there is no disbenefit for becoming unemployed, and the support means that you can get another job more easily. Unemployment in this city is incredibly rare. We have a economic activity rate well over 95%. It's very, very hard to be unemployed here, not least because there are so many jobs, far more jobs in Oxford than there are people. So we're now employing the children to work in the colleges and serve wine. which is not legal. But that's partly an effect of Brexit. If you remember who used to serve before the pandemic, yeah, when they are no longer coming, it's now the children of professors, which I think is quite funny. My children aren't complaining because the hourly rate's quite good. But it's these differences. This is Oxford. The problem in Oxford is getting a bed, not a job. Elsewhere, your job may be working in an Amazon warehouse for 9 hours with a half an hour break. And to do that requires a level of fitness and tenacity that mean you may not just be able to face doing it.
Patrick.
Danny, thank you. That was terrific. Really thought-provoking. Can I take you back to what you said about university, which actually hearing you say, it's so blindingly obvious that I suspect a lot of us here would echo the sentiment. Certainly the school I was at, I was the only one to go to university. Do you think it's right that you're reasonably pessimistic about the university sector? Do you think it's right that we should be encouraging people to go to university? Is that still the best passport for social mobility, however one defines that? And if I could then just ask a sort of supplementary question, which we wanted to hear your thoughts on. What would you do if you were the Secretary of Education with the education system today?
Okay. If I was Bridget Phillipson. I do a lot of school talks, and often at schools, the majority of schools that invite me are very well off. I don't take any money, they offer it. I always say, think about having a gap year, which these are schools where everybody has to go to university, but they have almost no choice and no freedom. And I do say you don't have to go to university, but it's difficult in those schools. In others, I do say, think about an apprenticeship and so on as an achievement. And don't go unless you really want to go. You can go a year or two later, you can make a better choice. The worst thing at the moment, we've had a lot of young people, and again, it's just the pandemic generation, who've gone, dropped out, started again, dropped out. Every time, that's another 9,250 plus interest on their bill. So if you really want to completely collapse the confidence of the children of the middle classes, we've made a mess of it. However, on the bright side of things, the UK is now at the highest rate in Europe of people going to universities. So if I was Secretary of State for Education, I would look at how are we going to transform tertiary education, university education, faster into what it's going to be in future, and not this idea that you are an elite small number of people reading for a degree. I suspect school leaving age in effect will be 21 in future, and we'll see 18 to 21 as still school. And it's worth trying to think, how do you get to that? And I'd question that the odd thing that we do, which most of Europe doesn't do and Scotland doesn't do, and even the United States doesn't do, we scatter people across the country. It's normal to go locally. I told the two of my 3 children who went to university, the one of my 3 children who hasn't, is by far the most economically successful, but the 2 who did go, I said, I want a really good reason why you're not going to go to Oxford Brookes. Because I have to pay the rent, but elsewhere. So the whole set of things we could look at. What do we do that other European countries don't where they do better? Finland, 90% of the student accommodation is provided by the state. It's cheap. You get a double bed, you get a cooker, you get a kitchen. It's palatial, and there's only one of you. It's unbelievable. Oh, and the people who get first on the waiting list are overseas students, because they have no family. Half of our university accommodation in Leeds and Sheffield and Newcastle is provided by very small companies making a fortune that are based in Jersey and Guernsey. You know, if you've been paying £7,000 or £8,000 or £9,000 for a child to be in halls of residence, a large chunk of that has gone into Jersey and Guernsey. So there's a whole set of things you could look at, but I'd take as an advantage that we've actually gone up to the high number already and say, okay, what do we do? Because we're basing this on a 1960s, 1930s idea, a kind of brideshead idea of Sebastian. We've gone through most of the first to go to university in their families now. We've gone through that generation where 80% of mothers thought when their baby was born they want them to go to university. It drops to about 60% by age 15, but it's still there. And think ahead and work out what does mass tertiary education mean. One of the worst things about our university system is telling almost every university lecturer that they have to be a world-class scholar. That's just cruel. It was easy in the 30s because there were hardly any of you. It's relatively easy in the 60s. But telling this mass workforce that they're supposed to produce the most amazing academic papers while they're also doing everything else is just silly. So we need to drop the gulf between school and education and work out that we've now got an age of adulthood, which is about 21. In Japan, it was always 20. And what are we actually doing? And make sure it's about teaching. Right? The other big issue of universities is they're one of our biggest export earners. They're keeping the large cities, they're keeping this city going. Apart from BMW, this city relies on overseas students. Newcastle, Sheffield, Manchester, billions. Glasgow, the most. There's whole quarters that have been built by overseas money. Overseas students are the only thing keeping our large cities alive. And we don't worry enough about what is it we're actually providing. And it's precarious. The other two growth industries are banking. Banking deregulated since we left Europe, and gambling. And we now make more money from gambling than the USA. But these three things we're relying on are precarious, and universities are a more edifiable thing, I think, than gambling and casino banking.
So Chris, put on. And then,
Thank you very much. Perhaps it's included in the first of the problems, but I was intrigued you didn't mention housing shortages, which is a recurrent problem across all the developed world. Why doesn't that score more highly on the list?
Yeah. I'm just checking where I put it. No, it was low. My category 3 was a bit of I stuck it into 3 with fear of crime and violence and so on, because it was so low that on its own it wouldn't get there. People don't mention housing as an issue, interestingly, even though it's a huge problem, particularly as in Oxford.
It's a huge problem in almost every large city in the developed world.
Although in some cities the problem is that they're demolishing some housing when their population's going down. It was only when we got enough overseas students, we managed to get 60,000 overseas students into Sheffield, and at that point we could stop blowing up tower blocks. So my eldest child, now 24, used to say bang when he saw a tower block, so I used to take him to see them being blown up on the terraces. But that's low quality housing. So getting housing wrong, housing being expensive, it is a problem in most places, but not everywhere. We are supremely bad at it. Our housing is of some of the lowest quality, it's the smallest, we have the least security of tenure, some of the highest rates of homelessness and sofa surfing, 250,000 people under 14, under 24 sofa surfing in London. We have some of the most expensive housing in Europe, and that's not even taking into account the quality. So housing's more of a problem here than in other places. There are particular examples where it's good in Europe. The Netherlands doesn't do badly. If you own a rented property in Amsterdam, the amount of rent you can charge is set, and you can't kick them out if they pay the rent. same as in Germany. Finland, my favourite country, you mentioned we read the book on Finland. The equivalent of Canary Wharf in Finland, the old docks at Helsinki, were not given over to the finance sector, as we did. It's a utopian set of social housing, which includes all kinds of different social housing, including housing where you put an investment in and you get that money back, so bordering own occupation. Housing for people who are homeless, they've managed to get homelessness down to less than 10 people in Finland. Not zero, but they know the names. And they even have housing on that site in Helsinki for retired Finnish rock stars who want to still practice in a music practice room. Now Finland's the poster child for housing in the world. The European Housing Conference was held 2 weeks ago in Dublin. Every 2 years there's a conference where European housing practitioners get together to talk about what they're doing. The worst rich country in the world is the United States, where 1 in 13 women in Baltimore is evicted every year. It's unbelievable. You've got forgotten how many million people is sleeping in cars. Trailer parks are normal. Trailer parks are slowly increasing here. Oxford's always had a couple. One in Marston, you may not be aware where it is. But across the Cotswolds, you'll see little caravan parks setting up, often kind of marketed as a nice place for a summer holiday. Right? But we're getting increasing numbers of people living in caravans here. But we're not good. I can't get too worried about housing because we've got enough houses, even here. We have more bedrooms per person than we've ever had, more empty bedrooms. Even in Oxford, in most wards, a third of houses has 2 empty bedrooms not being used. It's just you think, oh, that's the child's bedroom. That's the one they'll come back to when they split up from him and her. Right? Those are the bedrooms I need at Christmas. And yeah, it's nice to have bedrooms that are free at Christmas, and we're beginning to solve some of our housing problems. So we're increasing the council tax in those parts of Wales and Cornwall, particularly on second homes and holiday homes. We're changing the planning laws so you can't sell your house to be a holiday home after it's been one. We're too slow on this. We should go far, far faster. The Deputy Prime Minister is charged with building whatever 300,000 a year. She doesn't need to build 300,000 a year. There are other ways to get the stock to use. But it's not up there. When people are presented it as one of the 18 options, it isn't one of the top 3 that they tick because they're not thinking about it at the time. This afternoon I read a book about homeless mothers and their children in Britain. And there's been a 10-fold increase in rats since 2019. That must be the pandemic. Housing that's let out with no flooring and so on. So the situation is terrible. But it isn't scoring as the top concerns of people. We also adapt. So we become used to living in multi-generational houses. My 3 adult children live with me. I live in a house built by a servant in 1930s. I live in the smallest house I've ever lived in my life. And my colleagues come round to my house and they look at me and they go, where did you inherit all the money from that allows you to live in that house? Right? And that's Oxford for you. I mean, it is utterly remarkable. We have billionaires living in 2-bed houses in Jericho. Which is not a bad thing, but it's a weird situation to be in. Do you remember when they were developing West Barton Park? And I've forgotten the name of the development company. It's like Devonshire's or had a fancy royal kind of name. And they were doing the public consultation. And I'm quite a scruffy bloke. And I came to the public consultation in Marston. And the developer, who had very greasy hair, I can remember, was describing the penthouses that they were going to build just north of the Ring Road, which you could see. And I remember saying, my children will never be able to afford to live in them. And he gave me a look of pity. And I thought, I am dressing scruffy. But this is the housing problem, is how on earth we allow private developers to build executive housing within walking distance of John Radcliffe Hospital, where nurses could actually be sleeping. Right? Those are the kind of issues we need to address. But they're addressable because our population is going to slow down. It's not getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Part of the housing problem is inequality, rising inequality, meaning some of us can have a second or a third house. A third of children in private renting, that's due to rising inequality. But part of it is good news. Our housing system worked when we died around about age 70. The problem about living to 90 is you spend 20 years rattling around, often in your own, in a 3 or 4 bed family house. And it's good news that that occurred, but it would be nicer, I think, to have an apartment nearby with other people, with no lifts and with no stairs, that you would want to move to so that you can vacate the family house and go there and look over Oxford and see the Dreaming Spires. So I would build retirement apartments on the Seven Hills around the edge to let families into the middle. You've still got the question of what do you do at Christmas? But there are really, really exciting things to do at Christmas that do not involve coming back to the same house. I'm sure we can solve Christmas. If we can solve Christmas, we can redistribute the housing that we have. Yeah.
Thank you. Francesca, I think.
Dan, thank you. In your survey of fear, the index of fear, was there ever a question about artificial intelligence and its potential effects?
Okay, artificial intelligence, and it's not in the 18. It's the absolute fear of publishers. So my publisher wanted me to write about it. And they're worried that it'll take out their editing skills and they won't be needed and so on. And it's certainly risen. It's like the fashionable fear of the moment. And I'm absolutely happy to predict it to go down again. I have a section in the book on it. My favourite reference is Steve Wolfram, who wrote a 97-page book, I think it's 97 pages, on artificial intelligence. And he created Mathematica and other software. He knows what he's doing. And on page 97 of his AI book, he writes, don't worry, it's not going to scale up very much. This is what we're going to be stuck with. But he left the most important thing to the end. I'm a bit sceptical of AI because I'm old and I may not know. The first AI I know of was 1968 in John Conway's Game of Life, which created a computer program that could program itself. My supervisor, when I did my PhD in 1986, was writing neural networks, and we could create a sea slug, something with the ability of a sea slug. We then got through to the point of being able to recognise number plates and automatic translation. So this is my 4th AI revolution. And it's a bit like, think about what it must have felt like when you first saw a mechanical loom and how incredible that was. Now when you see prose that looks like a whole set of clever Google searches, it can be disconcerting because you're not used to it. The brilliant thing about AI is it knocks off the Oxford tutorial essay, right? Which I hate Oxford tutorial essays, and there's no need for them anymore because AI can produce them. You know, balanced, this side, that side, not too controversial, looking well read. So it requires imagination now. But I would just see it as another potentially beneficial thing. It's very upsetting that people are now writing letters with it, so that when they apply for jobs, most of the letters look the same, and they're not written by the actual applicants. And I also get upset, but I shouldn't, that my students from China, who used to methodically learn English to a ridiculous level, to the point at which you wouldn't know they were not English when you read their work, are now using AI to translate. And of course they are. You know, it must have been torture. But my biggest worry about AI is we're not going to get in the future as many of those wonderful people who can think in 2 or 3 languages in their head, who dream in a language they didn't grow up in, who talk to a lover in a language they don't know, right? That, sadly, that's going to go. But that's my biggest fear about AI, is the impetus to be really, really able at that will go when the machine will simply translate for you. But it could go in the courses.
I think Ros.
Thanks, Danny. I was thinking I would find that survey quite difficult to fill in because it's a mixture of cause and effect. And so, for instance, the high fear of unemployment might be because people are worried about AI.
Yeah. It's a very good question. They're very probably not worried about AI because AI is worried about by a small number of people who... It's like a Radio 4 thing, or a Times or a Telegraph issue. Because you can look at the differences by social class and income about fears. So, immigration, far, far bigger fear, even though it's much smaller than employment. AI is what the professional classes worry about. Poorer folk are more likely to worry about the immigrants, which I have in there. So it's an extrapolation from looking at the differences by social class of concerns. Also, I forgot to say, these are the responses to the 18 that are offered. Most people are not worried about most things most of the time. The classic is elections. Most people do not have a firm view about how they're going to vote. We ask them, but if they did really know, they'll predict the elections. Most people are not thinking about voting. Most of our concerns, most of you, depends on, I'm a man of a certain age, so you may be worrying about your bladder, which is why we don't tend to talk for more than an hour. You might be going, this man's voice is monotonous, or am I going to get a drink, or what the food's like. You're much more likely, which is not asked in the survey, to be worrying about personal things, friends and families, wife, husband, illnesses, very personal. The survey doesn't ask about those. So we differentiate between the private worries, which do tend to dominate us, and the public ones that we ask about. There's also a remarkable variation into how much we're worried or not. And some of it's genetic, as far as I can tell from reading. So some of you are just born optimists, happy, go through life, I've got no idea what depression might feel like. Others of you will absolutely know you'll be on drugs right now, and you'll go up and down and you'll know that. And there's this incredible personal variation in worrying, which I only touch on slightly in the book, but I think it's intriguing how hard it is for people to understand other people. I've got a lovely mentor, she's 89, she's called Sally, and she's never ever worried much in her life. So she finds it, well, I used to run a university, so she finds it really hard to empathise and understand that other people can have worries. Often worries that can appear very silly when you look back at them, but they're genuine. And so I don't concentrate much about that. Yeah. But that's so much bigger than the AI is going to come and get me. The people who worry most about or are optimistic about AIs, on my little poster here, these are the 5 of the 7 richest men who are behind Trump when he was elected. They worry about things like creating a white planet called Mars and taking the human population off it. Their worries are incredible. They worry about the singularity and when AI will take over from humans. And for them, these things are really important. But they're a very, very strange group of men that they're very interesting to look at. I don't think Elon Musk worries that much about his personal relationships with his partners or children. I could be wrong, but there's so many of them. I mean, how would you do it?
I think Emmy.
Hi Danny, thank you. Listening to you, I'm struck by an overarching theme, or maybe it's a personal fear on listening to what you're saying, which is the crisis of empathy, and how I'm thinking about that in the context of the times we're living through, where there is so much social isolation and disconnection, and that's been escalated through technological developments, but also since the pandemic. And we know that young people in our country are the loneliest they've ever been, but that travels through ages and also through social classes as well. And so I was just listening to you thinking, or really wanting to ask your opinion on what do you think helps people to care and to empathise more for those items higher up the list? What's it going to take?
Well, what did it take? Because some of them have come right up. They've already come up. When mass unemployment hit in the very early 80s, remember we had about 1 million unemployed in 79, it goes to 3 million, mainly young people by about 80 or 83, maybe 4 million. Most people didn't care. The Conservative vote rose in 83, it rose in 87, and you can look at where, and it was like, I'm all right, Jack. Because this wasn't something affecting most people in their families. So certainly the unemployed who lost their jobs in the shipyards and in Newcastle switched their votes, and the country polarised, and the Labour vote rose in the areas where unemployment rose. But the amazing, quite sad thing was that down here in Oxford, there was loads of money, literally shaking £10 notes at football matches. Right? If you want a memory of lack of empathy, was it Harry Enfield, the loads of money character? Yeah, but the football hooligans did wave their wads of money in the south at northern teams. For unemployment to have gone up since then to be the second biggest concern in the world requires lots of people who've got very little chance of being unemployed themselves or their immediate family to be worrying about it as an issue. That it's only possible. Most importantly, for inequality and poverty to have got right up to the top, it doesn't make sense unless there's been an increase in empathy. And then the question is, how do you get it? If you go back in this country, and you go back to when we were last very unequal, which is 1918, 1920s, 1930s, there were a series of publications which were designed to increase empathy. My favourite one is a book called Around About £1 a Week. In my head it was published, it must be shortly after 1918 I think. It was about how you live on around about £1 a week, written by Maud Pember Reeves. All the most famous ones weren't published until the 40s. The most famous is probably Brideshead Revisited, about that very rich family that came down and about social class. But the other one is Inspector Calls, which was again about the immorality of the family who owned factories and the servant girl that one of them got pregnant, and about how they're all going to be called account. So you have a culture of literature and books, and then radio with the BBC. The BBC used to be fairly revolutionary in the 20s and 30s. It was for the young people. It was high technology. We get comedy, which is round the horn. I'm looking for Monty Python, quizzical comedy. We had multiple Ken Loach films. You know, Kathy Come Home, Cares. There was a period of massive increases in empathy through culture and thinking about other people. There was a banker called Oswald Fox, who's a very nasty man in the 30s, but a good friend of John Maynard Keynes. He said to Keynes, when he did his general theory of economics, that what he was really doing was helping change the moral sentiment of the Bloomsbury set of the upper classes. And you could see a change in caring occurring in the late 30s. It was accelerated by the men who had to fight together in the First World War, and then accelerated again in the Second World War. But there are periods where empathy rises, coming together rises, and then there are periods when it falls apart, and people are told that they do well because they've worked hard, tall poppies rise, those people are lazy and scroungers. And there are periods when it comes together again. And we may be in a coming together again period. But it takes effort to do that, to see other people as like you. In many, many European countries, lots of things which happen here are simply seen as intolerable, because other people are seen as people. Whereas there are things that occur in this country how the Grenfell Tower fire was dealt with that don't occur in other places. I was talking to a doctor from Switzerland at a street party yesterday. He's working at JR. And he was just talking about the state of our NHS. And he said, even in Switzerland, we wouldn't allow this to happen. We're not that equal a country. But this is only possible because we've come so far apart that we're happy to have the largest hospital in Europe with trolleys in the corridors and not actually sort it out because we got to that stage. Having been, when the JR was built, the country with the highest life expectancy apart from 6 small countries, and the best infant mortality rate in the world because we are the first baby incubators in the JR. So we've gone from being a country which was economically almost as equal as Sweden when I was born in the 60s and 70s, with a high degree of solidarity, where every child has security of tenure, either with a mortgaged house or a council house. We've gone from that to an incredibly divided country where things occur which wouldn't be allowed to occur elsewhere. We have to go back again. It's depressing. This is why I stopped writing books about Britain. You don't get to be the most unequal country in Europe. You don't get to have rising infant and child mortality rates, children getting shorter, the highest rising child poverty recorded in the world by the UN, all the things I try not to talk about anymore. Right? You don't get to be off the scale this bad without having lost your empathy. And that happened to us. I think it's because we used to have an empire. I think it was too much of a shock, this coming together. I think the Monday Club and the Mayfair set fought against it. They were incredibly successful in the 80s about telling people you deserve to get rich if you work harder, getting taxes down to 40%. We still have the lowest taxes in Europe, apart from Switzerland and Ireland, and that's only because their GDP figures are dodgy. We have the highest taxes for 70 years and the lowest taxes in Europe. And that's because we have the lowest empathy. But if you want an excuse, geography. You have to have low empathy to run an empire. You mustn't care that much about people. And when I did geography in Newcastle, one of our lecturers once told us that he once killed a man in Africa. He killed him because he was a judge. He said the man might have been innocent, but he was good for discipline. So he put, when he was in the chair, he put the little black hat they put on and gave him the death sentence in Nigeria. When Nigeria got its independence, he needed a job, so somebody gave him a job as a geography lecturer in Newcastle. So I was taught by D-mob colonial officers. At Cheney School, I was taught by D-mob men from the army how to use lanes. The empire has a lot, I think, to blame. We need to sort ourselves out. But our education system is dividing children as much as we do, sending them to different universities. It's a brilliant education system to reduce empathy. My father was sent to a boarding school. Stiffer for lip, grow up. That's our legacy. Only one other country in the world spends as much on private education as us, and that's Chile, and they don't anymore. That's a legacy of having been the richest place on the world 100 years ago. You need a machine to reduce empathy if you're going to behave like that. And you need to believe that you naturally are born to rule. And getting our way out of that is not necessarily easy. As I thought as I was kayaking on the Thames on Saturday, and the young students from Orwell were informing me that they'd closed the river and only they were allowed to have it. And I was ever so kind to them. But the idea that an Oxford college can close the River Thames for the party of that college, right? There are only 52 Saturdays in the year. There were almost 40 colleges. Most of those Saturdays it's too cold to go on the river. It's a lack of empathy. Before I even go into the fact that Orwell will still burn the boat. I'll try not to upset. But places like the University of Oxford have to sort themselves out about these things. More than saying that people who affect us do. Because we have been bringing people up to think that they're special and born to rule, and with their special wisdom, they're going to make everything good. And that isn't how it works. It's not how things became good in the past. But I'm fairly forthright, very opinionated, and I think I'm getting very close to the end, so I might be safe.
We've got time for...
Damn!
No, we've got 2 more questions. Yes.
Okay.
Very briefly. 3 more questions. Peter, Jeremy and Peter. Peter at the back and then...
Hi, as a psychologist, just on your point about empathy there and lack of... It's not been my experience generally. I've been very involved with comic relief and everything that went there. And I found that in the British system and the British public, the British people, following your optimism thing, you could really engage with people to make the world a better place and to think about other people, your neighbours, and not having the leg up in life that you have. So I have a great positivism about the activity that goes on charitably in communities and across the country. And I think we live in a better place than we did 50 years ago on that. But one point I want to make that hasn't really been referred to was the effect of social media and these machines.
Yeah.
And old Jonathan Haidt position on the anxious generation. Is that anxiety largely vested in our generation and watching what's happening to the generation below? Or is it a concern of the generation who are affected by everything that's happened since 2008 and the effect of these tech barons you were talking about and what they're doing to people's brains and people's lifestyles, people's expectations and people's mentalities?
Do it quickly. I'm not an expert on everything, so I should. So I've looked in. I did do one paper years ago on child mental health, where of all the surveys done in all different countries. And it's interesting, when you take the USA and the UK out, it's not as bad a picture. You often get stories about how bad young people's mental health is in Finland. And the bottom story is, but it's still better than everywhere else in Europe. But the nice thing is that the Nordic countries worry about the mental health, and the suicide rate's really low now, compared to if these countries had a higher rate. I think the jury's still out on what the effects of having the phones will be. The tech billionaires send their children to schools where they're not allowed to use screens, which is interesting. A bit like how top financiers for large banks don't use their own products. Because they don't necessarily make you the most money. But I'm not pessimistic. The levels of anxiety are very high. They're particularly high in the most unequal countries. And that may well be because your choices are most constrained. So in a more equitable country, if you want to be a nurse, you can be a nurse, and you can have a good life as a nurse. In a country like ours, if you're brought up in the top 10% or top 5%, most jobs you cannot do. Your parents would be horrified if you did that. So your chances of succeeding are very low, and your chances of being a disappointment are very high. And that's a product of inequality. Having a divided education system, where we push children into schools where they're likely to get higher and higher marks, just means you're more and more likely to disappoint. Because if one particular school was boasting in the Oxford Mail I read today, I won't mention it, but how most of its pupils got a grade 9 at GCSE in most subjects. And if you go to a school where most people get a grade 9 in most of their subjects, you get an 8 or a 7 and you're a bit of a failure. If you go to a country where you go to the nearest school with everybody else, you're not stacking those kind of things up. But I'll keep it short because but I do worry. I've written the book because I worry about how much my students worry compared to what I think was the case when I was a student. But then it was easy. You didn't worry about what degree result you're going to get, and you went out a lot more, even in Oxford. In Oxford, there was the penny farthing, there was all kinds of things, if you remember. Oxford now ranks, out of the 61 university towns in this country, Oxford ranks worst for nightlife of all of them. Because the students all have imposter syndrome, and they're working 30 or 4 hours a week because they don't think they're good enough. And this is terrible for the Oxford nightlife, and it's terrible, I'm sure, for the students.
So just 2 more questions, then we finish off. Peter, and then Jeremy.
So,
was going to ask, does your relative optimism extend to the question of how we're going to cope with the increasing rate of decline of various populations around the world?
Okay. So I'm slowing down with books. The book I have to complete by September the 9th is called When Population Falls, which will be out in September next year, and then I slow. I'm optimistic about it. I think there's something incredible's gone on, where a bit like fish in a fish tank, we've kind of worked out that there's enough of us. You know, it's not, people say it's reduced because it's too expensive to have a child. I'm being a bit mean and I'm well off, but you have a baby, you can't go out anymore. It's actually relatively cheap. That to do it. So I'm not pessimistic, but it's never happened before in the history of our species. Even in the plague, the Black Death, we've never had, and this one is set to go on and on. It begins, by the way, in 2084. That's when UN currently say our population falls. It's coming forward every 2 years when they recalculate it. And almost the only way it won't happen, the population won't fall worldwide, is if we have an absolute disaster like a Third World War, and then we have a baby boom. The only reason to be pessimistic about it is if we're absolutely unable to plan and organise. It does probably mean the end of capitalism, which does rely on ever-expanding markets. Capitalism is relatively easy when you can expand into other countries to sell your product, or where more people are born every year, so that if you just do a steady state, you can sell more Coca-Cola. It doesn't work when you have fewer people every year born, and when you educate them more, so that they don't buy more clothes that they can wear. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is quite a big thing. But if you want the planet to survive, you can't have ever-growing consumption, and you want happy people.
So, last question for Jeremy, and then we'll break for dinner. Sorry.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. I guess some of the risks that you went through are to a greater extent self-determined, but many one would depend as an individual upon one's state and governance. And we're often characterised as an electorate where we think we know what we're most fearful of, but when it comes to the ballot box, we find a way, particularly as you characterised it, perhaps a middle-class survey, we find a way of ignoring it on the day and perhaps voting in a different way. I wonder whether there's anything that the survey tells us about governance, about the extent to which some of these risks are perhaps better mitigated by some states, some nations, more effectively than others, and therefore lead to a different view as to the level of risk that's held at an individual level.
Okay, very quick. The positive side in the survey, I got a whole section on conspiracy theories in the book, which is really fun. Particularly YouGov tested a number, and one of the ones they tested turned out to be a conspiracy theory by the time it went into the field, which was the Russian interference in the first election of Trump. So you never quite know with conspiracy theories. The good news is that the better organised the country, the less fearful people are, the more sanguine they are, and the more they consider what they do. But we are a prime country in danger. If Musk gets bored of Donald and chucks 50 million to reform, it should be game over. He should be able to buy it. We have no protections to stop this. So we if you want something to really worry about, it's that. But the good news from the survey is that in the fears of conspiracy, the fears of the lizard people, running the world from their yachts, are less in the countries which sort out their schools and their housing and everything else. So if you don't want... The bad news is that the country where people are happiest with government is India, because Modi's done a very good job still of convincing the population of India what a good job he's done. The statistics on inequality in India are unbelievable. The rise under Modi, which is... It's really hard to get the data. Modi has claimed to have provided almost everybody with piped water. It just isn't there if you go to the villages. But I'm only saying this because I know that the Indian Security Service don't monitor these talks, and I'll still be able to go to India. But the press, one of the most depressing things for me of looking at what people worry about is just how successful that Indian government have been in convincing people in India that their government is the best and most effective on the planet, irrespective of the pandemic. Life expectancy dropped 4 years in India. Only a year of that was the actual disease. 3 years of that was mismanagement by government of the crisis. The only other large country that lost 4 years was Russia. 1 year was COVID, 3 years was mismanagement, huge rise in maternal mortality. They go to war with Ukraine, nobody looks at what's happening anymore. In India, 250,000 babies died because they were no longer vaccinated because of the panic over the pandemic. So I don't want to end on a low note, but I think India is a lesson in the most successful right-wing political leader about getting the population to believe he's good for them over what he does. We don't talk about it. We talk about how popular Donald Trump is. We talk about Hungary. We talk about Putin. And we should look at the most successful state at convincing people who's making their lives better. When we measure their lives, on average, they're actually getting worse. And that, if you like, if you want my big worry, is that is even possible to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you for coming in.